I feel very honored to have been invited to share with you this very, very important occasion of celebrating the Women's International Day for Women, as well as the birthday of the Organization of African Unity. These two occasions are very, very symbolic in the sense that both of them represent aspirations for a life of freedom, prosperity, dignity, and justice for the women of Africa, for the people of Africa generally. That is the aspiration. The delivery doesn't always follow the aspiration to the letter. But maybe before I go into the task of tonight, because my task is the humble one of breaking the ground. The more exciting part of the sharing of tonight will happen among the panelists. Mine is to clear the ground, to highlight what is important about today and about today's gathering. But I must start maybe by, first of all, explaining that when I left Botswana, I talked to my mom, who's 92 this year, about why I'm coming here. And I can assure you that she, on behalf of many other women in Botswana, would like to send her greetings and her support. But for me personally, I would also like to start with a very big thank you to South Africa and South Africans. Maybe in a manner that is not always done in many forums. South Africa has been a good neighbor to Botswana. Botswana is a very small, small country with a very small population spread over a very large area of land. It is South Africa which supplies us with the food on our tables. Yes, we pay for it, but it is produced here. It is South Africa which provides us with the electricity by which we can read in our homes, power our homes, power our small, small industrial base. And I know that that is done at the expense of many South Africans who don't actually have access to light. South Africa provides us with support for the technology we can use, that we use in our homes, in our places of work, in our businesses, and our state institutions. We take credit as a nation for what we have achieved economically and in how we have governed ourselves as a country. But could we have survived? Could we have succeeded without a giant neighbor on our side, sometimes threatening the daylights out of us, but certainly protecting us from the vicissitude of life, providing us with a market, providing us pragmatically with opportunity simply to do business. Post-apartheid South Africa has also been of great benefit to the women and the people of Botswana generally. For years after most African countries had become independent, Botswana came to be recognized as the place where there is hope, as the country that is a good example of what it can be to have self-government that is accountable to its own people. A country which came to be so praised that we were in danger of complacency, of not recognizing the limitations, because we were being compared to an Africa where generally people could identify what had gone very wrong. So South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa came to set higher standards of what independence can actually achieve and what is still achievable. Constitutionally, by coming up with a constitution that provides a much broader base of the protection of human rights than our own constitution. For instance, the inclusion of gay rights and group rights of ethnic minority, which in Botswana were regarded as anathema, that it was un-African, in fact, to see same-sex relationship as anything natural. We still have in our laws a very clear discussion, a very clear commitment which still sees gay relationships as wrong morally and therefore punishable. But at least we've begun to open up the discourse of how correct that is to make an assumption like that. Politically, the inclusion of women in parliament, in political party hierarchies, in cabinet, South Africa has set the pace for the world and for its neighbors. Economically, in terms of enhancing our awareness for Botswana of the possibility that citizens can make more demands to benefit more from the exploitation of our non-renewable resources, particularly diamonds. Up until South Africa came with the ideas of black empowerment, that in fact the diamond industry does not have to be dominated by one company and one family. It was taken for granted that all we had to do was to be grateful that De Beers found us a good partnership, and that whatever they took, it's okay. They still give us something we never had, and we have used that to great advantage. So South Africa came and knocked out that idea from our heads that we can negotiate better terms of engagement and get more out of our resources than we've done, giving us the opportunity to be the first African country, in fact, to demand accountability from De Beers and to actually ask De Beers that since we are the largest producer of diamonds by value, then they should come and do business in Botswana and ensure that Botswana have skills other than to go and mine the diamonds and not know what happens to the diamonds after they have been mined. So I am, by listing all these areas of gratitude, saying I feel doubly honored to have been invited here to share in the reflections of what the 50 years of the idea of Pan-Africanism, the idea of African unity, of a shared vision, of the recognition of a common destiny, have meant for our region, our respective countries, our continent, but most importantly, for the status of women. When the Organization of African Unity came into existence 50 years ago, it was a momentous time. The years before had not even indicated that Africans could actually become independent of those who had colonized them. It was, in its days, the most important Pan-African organization on the continent, bringing together Africans who did not always agree. There were major disagreements in what ought to be done and how it ought to be done. There were fights. The OAU, in fact, represents a compromise between those who believe that in order for us to survive and progress economically and reduce our vulnerability to others who were technologically more advanced, that we could only achieve that by unity, creating a country called the United States of Africa, with all the different little countries as federations. And those who believed that that was an impossibility, that there was a problem basically just uniting the people within the boundaries that were set up by colonial powers, and to try and do that at continental level was just a pipe dream. So in the end, the compromise was the Organization of African Unity, dreaming of unity, working towards the liberation of the whole continent, but not quite tying themselves to creating a country, one single African country. That debate is still very pertinent today, but it isn't for me today to discuss whether we want to have one country or a federation, but to remind this audience that very much like 50 years ago, we have yet another opportunity to learn from the past 50 years, to rebuild the kind of Africa, to learn from the mistakes of the past, to build a just world for ourselves. I'm particularly honored that this particular meeting, this particular forum, is created under the auspices of the Thabo Mbeki Fund, which believes in the African people actually to do things for themselves. The world recognizes that we stand in a position where Africa has the greatest potential, as we stand today, to move the world economically forward. We have underdeveloped resources. Despite the years of exploitation, our land resources, our human resources have not actually been utilized optimally. There are still pockets of opportunities, huge pockets of opportunities to transform the economies of Africa so that they become, in fact, what China and India are today. That opportunity lies right here on our continent. And so it behoves us as the citizens of this continent to grasp that opportunity to build something better. We cannot make mistakes and allow ourselves not to learn from those mistakes. The time to be blaming others is over. It is nice to be able to point fingers at others for their exploitation of our continent, but there comes a time when we have to take responsibility of our destiny in our hands. What are we doing for ourselves? What legacy do we want to leave for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? Toko forgot to mention that, in fact, I am now a grandmother. My granddaughter is almost 3 months. The only creature greater than woman is always the granddaughter. So we have the opportunity to build a better future for ourselves and for the world. Are we going to grab that opportunity? Let us maybe take a step back and say, what is the symbolism of today as the 8th of March and the International Women's Day? What is the symbolism of celebrating 50 years of the Organization of African Unity, which for most of its life, we must say, never envisaged gender equality as part of its primary agenda? The Organization of African Unity came into existence specifically to fight for liberation against foreign dominance and particularly against racism. It has made great strides in that arena. But the issue of gender equality, of the dignity of women, has not been a very, very significant feature of how the OAU did its business for most of its life until it metamorphosized into the African Union in 2002. But we have to give great credit to this organization because it was the forum that has created an African identity, an African personality that we can only build on. So what's in all, it is our organization, it is the forum that brings us together at the same table to shout at one another, to scream at one another, but eventually to work together for the common will. But in relation to the symbolism of the International Women's Day, it is no accident that the organization that has held the torch in terms of moving the gender agenda is the organization called the United Nations. As we all know, the United Nations came into existence because technologically advanced economies of the world, those countries competed with one another in a very, very dangerous manner. They used their technology to fight and destroy each other's, one another's industries and cities because of the prevalence at the time that it was okay for some people to take full advantage of others, to advance their own self-interest at the expense of other human beings. And so, 2 world wars later, the parties recognize that you cannot actually enjoy your own freedoms to any full extent, to any long degree, if you do not also recognize the humanity of others, whether they are technologically less advanced than you, whether they are in terms of wars of weaponry, the ability to kill. At the end of the day, your own rights are safeguarded by recognizing the rights of others. And so it is through the United Nations that we had the Human Rights Charter, which has provided for those who have been downtrodden throughout human history an anchor, something to hang on to in order to fight for their rights. Because the architects of the Human Rights Charter, they did not, truly speaking, recognize that by having it, it meant that all and sundry could actually use it. When they said human, they did not necessarily mean all human beings. They meant certain human beings, just like the beginning of democracy when they said democracy was the rule of the people for the people. They did not mean every person. They meant propertied persons. So there is always an assumption that you can use a generic concept when in fact what you mean is you are going to protect your own rights. and the rights of those who you see as immediately threatening, but not those that you see as helpless and fragile and vulnerable. But we have to be very grateful of the existence of the Human Rights Charter, because it has provided a forum for women to also demand something that is very, very obvious, that they are human as well, and that they account for 50% of humanity. And therefore, the Human Rights Charter must, in fact, protect the rights of women. We had to attach to the Human Rights Charter protocols specifically identifying the rights of women as part of the rights of humans. And we will see the same thing happening with the charter that founded the African Charter. That in fact, this club of men assumed that when they were talking about Africa, they were in fact talking about themselves. And so an attachment to the recognition of the women had also to be made in the Women's Protocol. And so many years after the world, led by the United Nations, had declared the 70s as the first decade for women, the African Union only started declaring the decade for women, for African women, in the 20s. So 2010 to 2020 is the African first decade for the African women. So the emphasis I want to make here is that injustices have been recognized as the source of conflicts. Conflicts in the home, conflicts in the public arena, certainly conflicts among countries. That you cannot have an injustice and assume that those who suffer from those injustices will continue to happily live in conditions of injustice. Injustice has been the thing that has provoked throughout humankind, human history, the necessity to mobilize against such injustice. It doesn't always mean that when an injustice occurs, automatically there is, in fact, a reaction against it. But normally people mobilize because there is an injustice that has to be fought. And because there is resistance by those who benefit from that existence, the existence of that injustice, they have to be fought tooth and nail in order to give concessions. We cannot actually appreciate the importance of the International Day for Women without also recognizing just how much and how long the women of the world had to fight for their menfolk actually to recognize that they are human and that they must appreciate and acknowledge the injustices that the systems that are dominated by men actually perpetuate in terms of injustice, inequality, and lack of dignity. So the lessons we have learned are that, in fact, those who suffer from injustice must fight for justice, that it will never be offered on a golden platter. My people have an old saying that the pinching shoe is only felt by the person who's wearing it. Now, if you are wearing a shoe that fits, you have no idea what it feels like for your feet to be struck in a shoe that is 2 sizes too small. And those of my generation will know that we had to go to school in pinching shoes because our fathers and our mothers could not afford to shoe us all, given the sizes of our families and also the economic opportunities that were so stacked against black people during the heydays of colonial and apartheid domination. So we have come this far because the wearers of the pinching shoe decided to strike back, to demand of their governments, to demand of the institutions that collectively represented those governments, that it was time to recognize the humanity of women and to commit themselves and their resources to enabling an environment that will allow for the development of the humanity of women. And so that commitment was reflected in the adoption of the convention, what we normally call the convention, the Women's Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Our children will take it very much for granted. They have no idea how much blood, how much tears had to be shed to get to a point where our menfolk would actually recognize the importance of signing that they, in fact, on behalf of the people that they governed, would ensure that all forms of discrimination against women would be eliminated in their own countries, within their own cultures. It was easier actually to sign and ratify those conventions than in fact to deliver them. Take our presidents, all of them. Can we honestly say that in their own personal lives, they regard the rights of women as something they should fight for? That in fact, none of them actually sexually take advantage of the women they are supposed to be protecting, and think that it is culturally okay to abuse, that our culture is a culture of violence, that as Africans, we are taking away our Africanness if our menfolk cannot go around raping with impunity. As leaders, as workers, as ordinary men on the streets, even the homeless, that to demonstrate and celebrate their manhood, what better way to do it than to actually force themselves sexually on unwilling females? And that those females actually, at the end of the day, must be very, very grateful that they are being given sexual gratification by men of great status and importance. So until actually we interrogate that culture, which is very, very selective, by the way, selective use of culture where certain forms of discrimination are allowed, but the very same gentlemen are very happy to be wearing suits and living in huge, huge houses that their own grandfathers had only ever dreamt and assumed rightfully belonged to white people. It is our responsibility as those who feel the pinch of the shoe to ensure that no one can actually ever be a leader of the state and actually argue that it is okay to abuse women. That we must interrogate the men that we put in positions of office as cabinet ministers to say, If they abuse their own wives and their girlfriends, can we actually trust those men to do anything for our countries? I have already indicated that the OAU was an organization that had very lofty ideas, that throughout its existence was a male-dominated organization. I was going to say organ, but then I thought you might misinterpret. So symbolically, as the metamorphosis, Ghana, what is this word? These English words sometimes trip our African tongues. As it transformed itself into the AU, and finally recognized the importance of women in the structures of the AU, culminating in the election of Nkosazana Zuma as the first female leader of this Pan-African organization. We have to celebrate that we have come that far. Yeah? And you know that it was no walk in the park. How many times were these people asked to vote before finally they conceded to allowing this powerful woman to take control? 4 times, showing just how very, very reluctant. And when you look at it, what did they achieve in 50 years? That they should be so reluctant to actually allow a woman to get in there and change. Women have had to live under very, very difficult conditions to bring about reasonably well-balanced children. Yeah? Some of them, of course, the males, who then look at their mothers as chicken fodder. But having been able to bring up children under those circumstances, why couldn't they also lead countries and transform countries for the benefit of us all? I remember when we first developed a strategy for the women of Botswana to start fighting for the right to lead, trying to convince many of our mothers the justice of actually having women in positions of leadership, that if they can lead homes and ensure that their children survive, pinching shoe or no pinching shoe, that was enough training for them to actually lead countries, lead governments. That the men have no problems jumping into positions that they are ill-qualified for. They learn on the job and it's okay. And that if they can do it, women can do it even better, given the resources they normally have at their disposal to actually manage families. So we are posed today with a challenge of how we can transform our continent. We have the political opportunity, in fact, to do so. One of the areas I would like for us to look at constructively is the area of economic empowerment. I don't know whether that is the correct catchphrase, given that in South Africa in particular, and in many of our countries, when people talk of economic empowerment, they're basically talking about how the black people can take over and milk their governments, rather than about how they can transform economies so that even those in business appreciate that business comes from ordinary people, not from the state coffers. I look at how the banking system in Africa does not, in fact, serve the interests of the vast majority of African citizens. Africa's banks are the most profitable in the world, because all they have to do is to do business with governments, get nice, easy paychecks, and therefore do not have to think about how to create opportunities to create business for ordinary people who are not in government. They are here to give government business. And so we will suffer poverty, sustain poverty, as long as we do not transform our banks also to be democratic in recognizing that business comes from people, not from governments. That as long as our governments are richer than their people, the banks will always court the governments and not the people. I see no reason why in Africa, where most people still have access to land, we should be suffering so much from lack of adequate housing. Akira, the land is there. Our natural resources provide so much money. We have so many banks. Why can't our financial institutions transform the material conditions of business, transform our lands into housing, into property for the majority of the people? Why must it be left to charity rather than profit? Because what is happening now is that because our banks serve a very, very limited base of people with access to money, access beyond their capacity, in fact, to absorb the money. In fact, maybe to digress a bit, when I was traveling with the governor of the Bank of Botswana, who happens to be a female, and she was saying, I honestly have a serious problem understanding why we should be so greedy that we want to amass resources that we could not possibly utilize in our lifetime. Our belly, our stomachs have limited carrying capacity. How much food can you stuff into them? Yeah? Your body can only occupy a car at a time. Even then, a seat in a car at a time. Do you need to accumulate 20 cars? And do you need a mansion which can accommodate 100 people when there's only you, the wife? And then you also build small houses for the girlfriends, equally big. The logic of our economies is so illogical. And it is time that we did something about it. Why must we have such narrow economic basis? I wish I was a dictator with the capacity to say one day, let all the heads of industry go and live in those shanty towns and let them transform them and allow the people in shanty town to live in their mansions. I get one mansion can accommodate 150. Yeah. Let them go and show us what their business acumens can actually do to transform the lands of the shanty towns into nice, affordable housing. But until they do so, they don't go back to their mansions. Now we'll see how very creative and business-like these entrepreneurs are, who get easy money, increase prices beyond compare. Housing is very unaffordable for most Africans. How can that be when classical economists say that, in fact, an economy thrives on the capacity of its people actually to create effective demand? That business grows on the basis of what it delivers to people. Those classical economists had not lived in Africa during colonial times and the post-independence era, because they will have other theories about how it is very, very possible, in fact, for business to thrive on the basis of a limited few and make great profits without serving the majority of the citizens, without actually creating services that are required by the average person, and definitely without creating services that are needed by women. It is time. We don't want promises. We must create the conditions of taking over. How can South Africa, and South Africa here symbolically, have so much mineral resources, and yet the people who work those minerals do not even have a decent wage, do not even have decent homes? How is that feasible? How can we tolerate that? And then be amazed when the mine workers go on strike. To say now we need decent housing. We need a decent wage. Why should the corporate leader live in a huge mansion with many rooms, while the workers who create the wealth for this person have to deal with shantytown? Injustices bring about violence. And you cannot resolve violence simply by putting in more violence, by threatening mine workers for demanding basic decency. And unfortunately, the problems, Samarikane and others, are problems that are replicated throughout the African continent. It is upon us. This is our time. An erudite African scholar asked at the end of the last century, will this century be a century for Africa? Well, as long as Africans abdicate the right to determine their own destiny, it won't. But we have an opportunity here to create something better for ourselves and for our people. When I decided to leave the security of an academic job and a salary at the end of the month to explore the possibility of economic justice via housing, to try and see whether it is not possible to transform the assets that are held by plot owners into assets that can create housing and income for themselves, and decent housing for those who do not have the land and cannot afford the houses that are on the market today. Botswana epitomizes that malice where the houses that are provided, even the cheapest ones that are provided by a monopoly called Botswana Housing Corporation, are not affordable to the average citizen. Being poor is a very, very expensive state. You pay more per unit than those who are rich. When you look at how much it takes to pay for a small bag of sugar, and you multiply that 2.5 kg by how much it takes to create a 12.5 kg of sugar. You look at the price of the 12.5 kg compared to the price of the 2 kg, you will appreciate that the poor are paying very, very heavily for being poor, because they cannot afford to buy in bulk, so they buy small. But they pay more because they cannot afford to buy more. In the housing sector, it is the same. They can only afford small little rooms, and in that way finance the mortgages of those who can actually walk into the bank because they have a regular government salary to raise a mortgage and then provide housing for those too poor, in fact, to be able to buy their own homes. That cannot be allowed to continue. We have to break that monopoly. We have to democratize the economic space so that more and more Africans, and particularly more and more women who have not had equal opportunity in terms of jobs, employment, and income, to actually also be able to sit at the table and feed their own children. My job was to clear the path for the greater debate that is coming. And I was only asked to utilize 30 minutes. And I think I have exhausted the limit of my 30 minutes. So I am making an appeal to you as fellow Africans that let us take today as the day where we commit ourselves to economic justice. Economic justice is not about handouts. In Botswana, economic justice has been about how the government could buy food packages for those who cannot get employment, so that those who are employed could get huge salaries and afford to put their children in private schools and have 3 cars, more than 1 home, and basically enjoy a first world living standard in a third world country. This cannot continue. This cannot be allowed to continue. We cannot enjoy any lasting peace amidst so much economic injustice. And to the women of South Africa, we have recognized the problem of violence against women. And there is a tendency sometimes to think that all that it requires is to give some economic empowerment to those women so that they are independent of their menfolk. We have had incidences where women who become economically powerful under conditions of extreme inequality have been murdered by men who feel that they cannot, dare not, should not become independent and free, but should continue to depend on them for handouts, while the men depend on government handouts in terms of business, handouts in terms of food packages, and handouts in terms of jobs. Thank you for listening.